Well, it should make sense to listeners because what is the historical context that we find in the beginning of Jeremiah 1 of who Jeremiah is working under?
Yeah, I mean, under the great king.
Yeah, Josiah.
Right? Like, where things like the religious high point of ancient Judah.
And we'll remember, the listeners will remember from our reading in Kings that Josiah is the one who is said to have rediscovered the book of the law, right? The 5 scrolls, the Torah. And Josiah follows, this is really throwing it back to Kings, follows after Amon and more importantly after Manasseh. And Manasseh is the king who commits the ultimate sin.
This was Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, who I remember back in that episode I said, man, Manasseh must have hated his dad.
Yes. And so it makes sense that there's this connection between Jeremiah and this kind of Deuteronomistic theology, because this is the point in Judah's history that this is having its Renaissance period.
Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot Van Hoy,
and Natalie Hill. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. All right, folks, welcome back to our Cross Connections. We are in Jeremiah this week, and we'd like to welcome back the Reverend Rick Morley, fresh off of vacation.
I'm so glad to be sitting in this seat again with you two.
We missed you, although we loved having Tanya with us. So we're here this week. We're in the prophets. We got through Isaiah. We are kicking off Jeremiah this week. Is there anything you want to say, Rick, about Isaiah or the prophets in general that you didn't get to say or you felt like maybe we didn't quite cover?
So I only listened to the first of your episodes on Isaiah, so I don't know what you said in the second episode. But, you know, my standard thing on prophets is that, like, most people think that prophets are like fortune tellers, like, because Hollywood tells us that a prophecy is about what's, you know, coming in the future. And that's not what biblical prophecy is about. It's about God usually speaking to the present. And what we call the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, that's exactly what's going on, is that God is using these 3 prophets to speak to the current situation. And as such, all 3 of them are trauma documents. We've used that word throughout, but they all 3 deal with some form of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity. First Isaiah shows up way before and is saying, if we don't turn around and stop what we're doing, this terrible thing's going to happen. And then by like second Isaiah, the terrible thing has happened. And by third Isaiah, there's some hope that we're going to be able to come back. And then Jeremiah is really close to the destruction of Jerusalem, this big thing. And then he gets wrapped up in the whole event. He gets left behind for a while. His life is utterly changed because of what happened with the Babylonians. And then, of course, is Ezekiel, who we'll get to, I don't know, 6 months from now or whenever that is.
It's only a few episodes from now.
Okay.
But
you know, he gets sent off to Babylon. He's a priest, and so he's in relatively upper class, and the Babylonians took the upper classes off. So all 3 of these prophets are dealing with this like incredibly tumultuous thing. You know, their nation was humming along, and then they ceased being a nation. Like, they were done. They were Some of them stayed behind and basically starved, and then some of them were taken off to Babylon, and Babylon tried to change them. And so Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are each in their own way dealing with this massive trauma that has happened.
This big political fallout that they're warning that's going to happen. They can see in the moves that are being made in contemporary time, this isn't the right move to make. We need to be moving in God's ways and trying to do what they can to reconcile that, or just, you know, in the midst of this, you have to.
Isaiah and Jeremiah begin with doom. If we don't stop doing this, a terrible thing's going to happen. And then they don't stop doing that.
Right.
and the terrible thing happens.
Right.
So,
And then Ezekiel's mostly dealing with, here's the terrible thing that happened. And
right.
here's where
This terrible thing happened, and
And
now
then,
and now what? And both Isaiah, we'll get to Ezekiel, but Isaiah's after the terrible thing, we get to come home. There's a 70-year hiatus in Babylon, but then everyone gets to come home and start rebuilding the nation. The little bit of hope that we find in Jeremiah is the idea of the remnant, that there's this, most of Judah is destroyed, but there's a section, there's a portion, there's a little bit. They remained faithful, and so the dream isn't lost, the story isn't over, and there will be more.
Yeah.
So they're both dealing with trauma, and they're both trying to find. They're like, we know that there's always hope with God, so how are we going to say this? Like, how is there hope in this situation, which seems so hopeless? Well, some of us are going to get to go back.
Yeah. And placing these, again, in the timeline from our more historical texts. As we said before, Isaiah is the prophet during Hezekiah's reign. You're going to find all this stuff in 2 Kings. This is like the end of the various kings leading into the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. I think we're going to maybe even revise Eliot's the kings in 1st and 2nd Kings and maybe note where the prophets are on that for you so that you can kind of look back and be like, oh yeah, that's right. This is when Isaiah is prophesying, and oh, this is when Jeremiah is prophesying. I may have this slightly off. I have it kind of scribbled on a page in front of us at the moment because there's a little question about exactly where Jeremiah starts, apparently from the two different things I was reading. But I did find it interesting to note that Jeremiah and Ezekiel are essentially contemporaries.
Yeah.
That they are, they were living at the same time. Ezekiel's call is slightly different at a slightly different timing, but Ezekiel and Jeremiah lived through much of the same history, but had different paths towards the end because of the fall of Jerusalem. That Ezekiel ends up, as you said, in exile in Babylon, whereas Jeremiah ends up staying in Jerusalem for a while and then eventually flees to Egypt.
Yep.
So that's kind of the historical context for where they are.
They're also two totally different prophets, and Ezekiel has all these fantastical visions, which are just kind of wonderful and amazing. It's not that Jeremiah doesn't have visions, but they're not as fantastical.
Right. So that's something to look forward to, but interesting to kind of note where they are and that they're close together there. So Jeremiah itself, we'll get back to that since we had a little overview
Longest
of those
book of the Bible.
again. The longest book of the Bible.
By word count.
That's right.
We
That's
talked
right.
about that
We
in
did talk about
Psalms.
that.
Yep.
That there's fewer chapters than Psalms by quite a bit, but the chapters are
Fewer chapters in
huge.
Isaiah, Jeremiah. You mean?
Fewer chapters in Jeremiah,
Yeah.
but
Right.
the
But
chapters
more
are
words.
huge.
Yeah.
If you're following along the reading plan and you're reading like 3 to 4 chapters a day, like all of a sudden the reading load has increased exponentially because they're long.
They're long.
Like, are we still in the same chapter? Like, oh my goodness.
A lot of poetry again.
Yep.
There's a mix of the poetical prophecy and oracles and narrative moments. So that's kind of an interesting balance between the two. I was reading that there's kind of similar to how Isaiah has 3 sections, that Jeremiah is chunked into like 4 sections.
I think it's more than welcome to introduce the idea of how to read this book. I think the readers would probably love to hear the 4 sections you have in mind, Natalie. And I think there are literary ways to break up Jeremiah. One thing I would say is I actually find Jeremiah to be kind of chaotic book.
It is.
It's not clearly delineated in the way something, say, like Isaiah is, where Isaiah scholars, and even as the reader, you have a very clear sense this really does fit neatly into these 3 kind of compositional categories. Jeremiah is really not that way at all.
Yeah.
It's not clear what are the transitions here, what are the kind of editorial compositional shifts here. Jeremiah has this scribe, Baruch. A lot of people think he's responsible for writing and editing a lot of this book. It shifts a lot between poetry and prose to kind of narratives versus oracles, and you don't have a clear sense of like maybe when this is happening or why this shift is taking place. I think the one thing probably worth saying that contrasts Jeremiah from Isaiah is Isaiah compositionally takes place over a very long period.
Right.
Jeremiah, by comparison, is a much more tightly packed window of when we think this was written and composed. But that doesn't speak to kind of literary divisions, which I think you had in mind with your 4 divisions, Natalie.
Yeah, and I didn't come up with this on my own because I'm not that smart, but and I certainly
You're smart
haven't
enough.
studied Jeremiah that deeply. But the author of the book that I had been using as a reference, the How to Read the Bible Book by Book, this is Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, and it may not be the best resource out there. I didn't go to seminary, but this one suggests that there are 4 sections. Chapters 1 through 5, which is 1 through 25. Which is oracles and symbolic actions announcing the coming doom of Judah and Jerusalem, which is obviously all that stuff that ends up happening. And it's kind of conversation between the prophet Jeremiah and Yahweh. And then chapters 26 through 36 are a collection of non-chronological, not in order, narratives. Here's where some of the confusion's going to come in, right?
Yep.
Stuff's not in order. But that those narratives also have kind of sandwiched in the middle of them these chapters, the chapters of hope, which are 30 through 33.
Yep.
And then it shifts again from 37 to 35. This book,
37 to 35.
37 to 45.
There we go.
Sorry, folks. I'm having a bit of a day.
Long Tuesday.
Just a foggy Tuesday for me. Chapters 37 to 45 have a series of narratives, these ones being in chronological order and reflecting the fulfillment of the stuff that was prophesied or mentioned earlier in the first section. And then that the final section, 46 through 51, and with the epilogue is of 52, are oracles against the nations. And we've talked about this before, that in Isaiah, we had that where there was the oracles regarding Judah, Jerusalem, and then the oracles that had to do with the nations. So we have some of that in Jeremiah as well.
Right.
That's a thing we're going to come up against in the prophets a lot, is that there's going to be a lot of prophecies, oracles, usually against Judah and Israel, depending on when they're written. But then you're also going to have all of these oracles against the other nations. It's like as if to say no one is spared God's wrath, because no one's doing it the way they should be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, throughout both what we saw in Isaiah and in Jeremiah is the nations, capital N, like the surrounding peoples, in this case the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, they are vehicles for God's will, usually God's judgment. So that's really kind of critical. And it continues the theme of the Deuteronomistic Historian.
Yes.
Which is really deeply connected to Jeremiah.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, Jeremiah is either a student or a teacher of Deuteronomistic theology.
Yeah.
And remember that theology is, if you do bad things happen to you.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about this throughout this podcast, that, that was one way of viewing things in the Bible. It is not the only way that things are viewed in the Bible. There are other teachers and other books that have different ways, but the Deuteronomistic Historian definitely sees a linkage between when you do something bad happens to you. And Jeremiah, there's a scholarly hypothesis. It's not I don't think it's a majority view, but it's interesting to me that Jeremiah's editor, his scribe, Baruch, might have edited the Deuteronomistic history and we talked about it when we went through it, that they were written over a series of time, but there were some through lines to it. And the scholarly thought is that Baruch is the one who put the through lines throughout the Deuteronomistic history.
Right.
Yeah. And it's not just there's some interesting data behind that hypothesis.
Right.
Which we won't get into here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't fully understand the explanation in the book I read about the way that Jeremiah is composed in those 4 sections, but they were indicating that there's a suggestion that the pieces that are non-chronological are put in there in the way that they are because of how they relate back and what kind of story it ends up telling. So that just
Interesting.
made me think of what you were saying about how Baruch edited that through line into it. I found going through the Old Testament, the Deuteronomistic Historian's theology feels so dominant. It's almost like you can't get away from that theology that's in here. It just keeps coming back up.
Well, it should make sense to listeners because what is the historical context that we find in the beginning of Jeremiah 1 of who Jeremiah is working under?
Yeah, I mean, under the great king.
Yeah, Josiah.
Right? Like,
so,
where things like the religious high point of ancient Judah.
And we'll remember, the listeners will remember from our reading in Kings that Josiah is the one who is said to have rediscovered the book of the law, right? The 5 scrolls, the Torah. And Josiah follows, this is really throwing it back to Kings, follows after Amon and more importantly after Manasseh. And Manasseh is the king who commits the ultimate sin.
This was Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, who I remember back in that episode I said, man, Manasseh must have hated his dad.
Yes. And so it makes sense that there's this connection between Jeremiah and this kind of Deuteronomistic theology, because this is the point in Judah's history that this is having its Renaissance period, right? It's returning. Josiah is getting rid of the idols, the worship of other gods, the high places to the Baals. Remember, that's a really big deal in Kings. And to your point, Rick, about this idea of Baruch maybe playing a role in both the composition of Jeremiah and the composition of the Deuteronomistic history, some of the lines, I was actually reading this just today, some of the words, to your point about the connection between them, are things like the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow. This comes up a lot in the Deuteronomistic history, and it comes up a lot in Jeremiah. Ideas like you following other gods. This is really big in both. The land that I gave to your fathers of old. This is this idea of the land, the inheritance, and then this idea of establishing my name. These are kind of like linguistic cues that these two are very connected, maybe potentially through someone like Baruch.
Well, the two great sins in like the two general sins of the Deuteronomistic historian in their view is you're either failing to be a just people. So widows, orphans, strangers, the hungry, the sick, they are not being tended to. You are getting wealthy and they are falling behind. And so that is why God is coming to destroy you. Or the other sin is you are not honoring God and you are honoring the Baals or idols or something like that. So it's either
and usually they're connected.
Yes, usually.
Right.
A lot of times.
Now when we get to the minor prophets, we're going to see that the minor prophets are either a social justice prophet, or they're a religious practices prophet. Like they're going to pick one or the other to rail against. But in the major prophets, we see like all sins are able to be talked about.
It's interesting that you even bring that up, because we see that division almost even in Isaiah versus Jeremiah, because if the listeners listen to our first 2 episodes on Isaiah, they'll remember Isaiah has a lot of Amos-like language of, do I delight in your festivals? Do I delight in these religious observances? No. What I'm really looking for is justice for the widow, the poor, the orphan, the poor. And this is really actually kind of a shift beyond Deuteronomistic theology. But I think in Jeremiah, we see these two much more closely wedded together. A good example, I don't think that, as far as I can recall, I saw this in Isaiah really at all. In Jeremiah, there's a lot of language through these first 15 chapters and throughout the book of this idea of polluting the land. And this is really Deuteronomistic, right? Because at the core of Deuteronomistic theology is you have been given this land as an inheritance, and you now need to live a certain way in order to keep the land clean, right? Really important to Deuteronomistic theology is this idea of like, you can't intermarry with foreigners. You can't worship foreign gods. Like this, these are purity issues.
I, God, have given you this land, and therefore how you honor me is by living in it well. And if you don't live in it well, then you pollute this thing that I've given you. You haven't honored the gift. And therefore you get to be destroyed.
Which is such a hard category for I think, us modern people to think through, because we don't think about actions and its relationship to land. At least many of us don't in modern Western society. Right. But to even give an example from this first few chapters, chapter 3, verse 2, at the end of that, Jeremiah says, "You have polluted the land with your whoring and wickedness."
Yeah.
That takes us to another theme Jeremiah loves, of this theme of Israel as an unfaithful wife. This also is echoed in other prophets like Hosea. So that's something we can talk about. But maybe some metaphors and categories that we don't really think about the world in the same way.
It's another big prophetic thing. And we're going to, the classic example of the unfaithful wife is the book of Hosea, which we'll get to, and we'll probably deal with this in granular detail. Right. But one of the great metaphors for the human relationship with the divine, I mean, there's lots of metaphors, right? Mm-hmm. There's a shepherd, and there's sheep, and there's king, and there's people, and there's judge and widow, and
vineyard and tender.
Right. And there's husband and wife, that God's people are like married to God. And so one of the ways that we honor God is by being faithful to God. And so in that prophetic metaphor, when the people go off and they worship another god, they worship Baal or Asherah or something like that, then it's like they have cheated on God.
Right.
And we have encountered this before. I know that there was a bunch of language using, women as the model for faithfulness and unfaithfulness back in Proverbs. And I remember specifically there in Proverbs, one of the things that was important to note was that it was very specifically written to a male audience. And if you think about the time and who the prophets are dealing with, most of these Old Testament prophets are men. Yep. And they are dealing with speaking to the political leaders of the time, the kings, the ruling classes of the time, who are also predominantly male. Right. And so this is kind of why you get that bent where it's the unfaithful woman. You don't have here the unfaithful husband because generally you're not speaking to a woman when you're giving this. But you could just as easily do that today.
Right. I think we do have to be very careful here. And like Rick said, we'll get into this more in Hosea. But it is a really dominant metaphor in Jeremiah. So just to give someone a textual example, especially throughout the first 10 chapters or so, in chapter 3, verse 20, you read exactly what Rick said, this classic metaphor of marriage. And so 3:20 says, "Instead, as a faithless wife leaves her husband, so you have been faithless to me, O house of Israel, says the Lord." So you see it plain as day there, right? Like it really spells it out for you. Faithless wife leaves her husband. You, Israel, are the faithless wife. I'm the husband. And I think you're right, Natalie, to just draw our attention to the ancient Near Eastern historical context. I think it is so easy for us to read these works from our modern lens where men and women are equal and forget that, this is a world where unequivocally, on every level, women there's no concept of rights, right? Women do not have rights. Women do not have autonomy. Women are viewed substantially as property through marriage, levirate marriage, things like a man takes a wife, she leaves her father's home and goes to her husband's home.
They give birth to people.
They give birth to people, right? They're in many ways viewed for their ability to birth men, right? So
specifically.
But my point here is, this is the context of the world, and so these are the metaphors that they're drawing on. And I think it's okay to recognize that these are historically contingent metaphors. These don't have some universal basis, and that it's important to contextualize it in that way.
Yeah, there were other ancient Near Eastern religions that also talked about the relationship between their gods and their city or their nation in a marital way. It was true in Marduk in Babylon, the same nation we're talking about, defeating Israel here. And for me, I think this metaphor cuts into two different ways. It's really hard, I think, on our modern ears to keep hearing all the talk of whoredom.
Right.
Like, oh my gosh. And yet the primary metaphor is that God wants to be our spouse. It's this tender, close, meant to be beautiful metaphor.
Right.
Song of Songs.
Song of Songs.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And so as hard as the unfaithful language is here, and as hard as it is on women to look at it from the ancient perspective, I think we can also recover some tenderness and some beauty there.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Obviously, the writers are looking for something that people can relate to as well. And something like marriage was, that was a thing that everybody understood in that context.
Yep.
What did that look like? What were the societal, cultural norms around that at the time? They can relate to what those norms were and understand this metaphor very clearly in their day.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this in really helpful, Natalie, in our Isaiah episode about how the prophets in particular is a form of genre that is replete with metaphors. I mean, it's all throughout, significantly so compared to other works we've been reading. And so there's all kinds of metaphors that are being used. There's the metaphor, really importantly, of the vineyard. So we're going to see parables crop back up in the New Testament and the Gospels about vineyards. And it's not just, a lot of times when we read the Gospels, we think, oh, they're just using metaphors of vineyards because people would have understood
had
that.
vineyards, right?
People had vineyards.
Yeah, right.
Well, no, actually, it's because that's the way God's relationship with Israel is described.
Had been described.
Places like here in Jeremiah.
Exactly right.
They also use, Jeremiah's fond of parental metaphors, Israel as a disobedient child. In Jeremiah, you see a lot about shepherds. Again, this is going to be really critical when we get to the Gospels, understanding Jesus as the good shepherd. In Jeremiah, he is constantly using the metaphor of the current leaders of Judah being bad shepherds. So, this is also just a way of saying, to your point, Natalie, that, these are significant metaphors in the time of day, the historical context that really are critical for how Jeremiah is vividly portraying these relationships and situations.
Yeah, there was some other, the figs.
There's
figs come up. I always relate to the figs because there's a fig tree in my own
This
yard.
is why when Jesus curses the fig tree, this is connected to things we see in the prophets. Jesus really inhabits prophetic kind of language and symbology in his own ministry. I think really important to understand.
Yeah. And God as the potter is another one that's in here in chapter.
Yeah, that one's big in Jeremiah and Isaiah, and that's going to become really big in Paul's letters. We'll see that come back in Romans famously. So
that's a really good point, Elliot. They're not just using common things around them.
No.
They're using bits from the scriptures that everyone would have known.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's really critical when we get to the New Testament. The New Testament imagery is so saturated in Old Testament imagery.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's not just contemporary to the New Testament writers. It's also reflecting back the Old Testament.
Which answers, one of the questions I've gotten a lot over the last 8-9 months is why are we reading the Old Testament? It's so hard. It's hard to relate to. It's sometimes bloody and terrible. Part of the reason we read it as Christians is because it's hard to fully understand the New Testament without it. I mean, you can, but you're going to be missing so much.
Yeah,
great example. I love from the beginning of Jeremiah 7. This is famously called Jeremiah's temple sermon. So in Jeremiah's day, there's a lot of false prophets. And one of the things the false prophets do in Jeremiah's day, and this may be important for us to understand today perhaps, is they say that there is peace and that things are great when things are actually not great. And there's not a lot of peace, but they're really reassuring that, oh, don't worry, everything's okay, everything's okay. So in Jeremiah chapter 7, God says to Jeremiah, all right, you're going to go and stand in the gate of the temple and you're going to say things aren't great, right? You guys need to change your ways. And famously, what does Jeremiah say there? And anyone accustomed with the Gospels will recognize this. This is Jeremiah 7:11. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight?
Gosh, that sounds familiar.
Huh. Sounds kind of like something Jesus says in the in the Gospels, right? Matthew 21, he goes into the temple and he says, this house, which has been called by my name, has become a den of robbers. So again, it's
Is that when he turns over the tables?
Yep.
Yeah.
it's critical for us to, you read that in the Gospel of Matthew and you think, oh, what a powerful turn of phrase, Jesus. Well, it's not just Jesus's turn of phrase. He's drawing on Jeremiah. And not only that, it's not just drawing on Jeremiah for Jeremiah's sake. He's setting up this symmetry between Jeremiah's day and his own day, just like the people of Israel in Jeremiah's day are trampling the poor, are not caring for the widow and the orphan. Yep. The temple in Jesus's day famously has turned the temple into a place,
like a marketplace.
A marketplace and tax collection and taking the money from the poor, which is, if anyone listened to my sermon on the widow's mite, the exact opposite of what the temple is supposed to be doing according to Deuteronomistic law, right? It's supposed to be providing for the poor and the widows and the orphans. And so that's what Jesus is saying, right? He's like, just like in Jeremiah's day, we are continuing to do this. So it really deepens and enriches our understanding of what Jesus is doing in the Gospels, which is just, my way of affirming what you said, Rick, that it's really critical that we're reading this and understanding this context.
As hard as it is sometimes.
As hard as it is. Yeah, absolutely.
There is in middle of chapter 8, verse 11, they've healed my dear people's break too lightly, saying things are well, they're well, when they're not well.
Yes.
I love that. Like, because I always think about, like, you see people on the street, they're like, hey, how are you? You're like, I'm good. When you're not good, right? But you just say you're good.
Well, it's even worse than that, because it's like, if I knew you were really suffering, Rick, and someone was like, hey, how's Rick doing? He seems like maybe
great.
I'm like, oh, Rick's great. Like, he's living his best life, right? Like, that's really what these people are doing.
Yep.
And I do love that too, because I think our culture, I can't speak for other cultures. I'm not much of a world traveler, but I can certainly speak for our American culture, the one I've been raised in and grown up in, and particularly our Christian culture in many churches. We are very fond of speaking comfort and advice into people's challenges and sufferings and troubles. And I think we are a people that are very uncomfortable with sitting in difficulty, challenge, pain, suffering, sorrow. And I think Jeremiah, who we alluded to in our Isaiah podcast, but we actually haven't said yet, is known as the weeping prophet. He really challenges us, I think, as contemporary American readers, to recognize that it is the false prophets who say, comfort, comfort, peace, peace. And it's not to say you can't comfort people or give peace, but when things are not all right, we need to be able to name that things are not all right. And I think a lot of people are really uncomfortable with this. In fact, I just was talking to one of our priests here on staff, Peter, who a year or two back had written something in a letter to the parish about some of the challenges we were facing as a parish, especially in a time of transition. Yeah. And someone said, well, why would you say that? Why would you say that? You need to name the good things, right? Like all the good things happening. And I think I'm not belittling that sentiment.
No, it's
I understand
real
it.
sentiment.
It's real.
Right.
Like, yes, we should don't focus on the negative things going on, but I don't know. Jeremiah pushes back against that kind of mentality, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit. One of the phrases of recent years you may have heard is toxic positivity.
Yeah.
Where everything's happy, everything's great. Hashtag blessed.
Yeah.
But things are not. And we keep trying to go through the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm having a day and I'm feeling the weight of the world around me right now. And it's really hard to just keep showing up to function as a normal human being when there is so much happening that is causing pain in people. And it feels really unnecessary. Like this is and wildly unjust. Yeah. And it's really hard to just show up and say, well, today I'm going to create a graphic for that forum series coming up in September and ignore like all of the shouting happening elsewhere. That I know is causing pain to people that I know and love, or may be about to cause pain to people I know and love. That's hard.
Yeah, definitely. that there needs to be a space to kind of acknowledge and recognize the things happening in our lives and in the world, right? That this is both personal and communal. I think that's another thing we talked about in Isaiah that the prophets really challenge us to recognize, is that the personal and the communal are not separate. And so when things are going on in the world that are unjust and evil, like you're talking about, Natalie, these are the things Jeremiah is addressing in his time as well, the things that are unjust and evil. And it has personal ramifications and effects on us. And that's important to recognize.
And just from our own life experience, that when Jerusalem was falling and the sky was falling and, people were dying and starving, that there were people like, oh, God's good.
Yeah, right.
Right? Like,
just
hashtag
wait it out.
blessed.
Hashtag blessed.
Right? Like, you just wait. It's going to be, we're going to get it's going to be better than before.
Totally.
Instead of sitting in the pain and dealing with the people who are weeping and crying and hurting.
Well, and Jeremiah offers such a powerful picture of this in his own person. I think this is one of the things I love about Jeremiah is I think it's maybe fair to say that Jeremiah is the most personal of prophetic works, that you get such an insight into who he was, his inner life. Ancient writing doesn't often delve into the inner emotions of people. Jeremiah really does in a unique way. And so take Jeremiah 9, for example, at the beginning of the chapter. This is Jeremiah speaking. And in some sense, what's really powerful about Jeremiah, and this is true of all prophetic literature, is there is actually, scholars will talk about a merging of the voice of the prophet and the voice of God, such that they will talk about, it can be difficult to distinguish
who's talking here.
Right. Obviously, here in 9, we have Jeremiah talking, but I just wanted to acknowledge that, to always keep in the back of one's mind that in some sense, the Lord is speaking as well. And so the start of chapter 9 says, "Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people." Yeah. And it's hard to read that and also sit with this belief of, oh, well, we just need to focus on the positive, right?
Right.
No.
Well, and remember, Jesus, we have Jeremiah weeping over Jerusalem here. Mm-hmm. Jesus also weeps over Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yep.
The reality is that if you keep going to the hashtag blessed, everything's going to be fine, nothing will change, because acknowledging the pain in the world is required in order to do something about it, to make those changes. And that is what the prophets keep calling for. They are witnesses to the pain that the political elite and the rulers and those with power and wealth are in charge of. Watching these things happen, understanding how that's not aligned with what God is calling for, speaking God's voice for the people with the intention of creating the change. You're not going to create the change if everything's fine. There's nothing to change if everything's fine.
That's right, yeah.
Right? So no wonder the false prophets are the ones saying, no, everything's great. It's all going to be fine.
No, right. And because the last thing Jeremiah wants to do is to put a warm blanket over everybody and make people comfortable.
Right.
Because he wants change.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
Because he believes that God wants change. And if we just lay around under a warm blanket, then nothing is going to change.
Right. And I think the key for Jeremiah and the prophets is that, to your point there of God wants change, Rick, is this idea that it is by embodying God's mercy and justice that change will be brought about. And so at the end of Jeremiah chapter 9, which we just read from, this starts around verse 23, and I won't read the whole thing. I'll paraphrase these few verses. But Jeremiah is saying, "Thus says the Lord, don't boast in wealth, don't boast in might, don't boast in human wisdom," right? These things. So even if there are people that think we can change things, it's what Jeremiah says is, if you are going to boast in this, that they know and understand me, that I am the Lord. And then this is how the Lord defines himself. "I act with steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, says the Lord," right? And so Tanya spoke, I think, really aptly in Isaiah about how these words for righteousness and justice in the prophets really the best way to translate them in our modern idiom is as social justice, that these are changes for the entire community that are going to uplift the entire community. So I think that's a really powerful passage of Jeremiah for me, especially that self-definition of the Lord, right? I act with justice and righteousness, with steadfast love, and I love that in the earth, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole, thing about religion getting out completely of politics, like just focus on spiritual matters, right? Prayer and contemplation,
right?
And leave the worldly stuff completely alone,
right?
And for us to do that, we would need to rip Jeremiah out of the Bible.
You'd have to rip out a lot of
and
well,
Isaiah,
I mean, you just have
and
to tear
Ezekiel,
apart most of the
all
the Bible.
all four of the Gospels,
Right.
And Jeremiah
What
is
are you left
deeply
with?
deeply
Genesis,
concerned
maybe?
with what's going on around him.
Right. Yeah, we talked in Isaiah. I keep referencing Isaiah, but these two go together so well.
Yeah.
That language from Isaiah of being, this will come out in episode 2, so Rick hasn't heard this, repairers of the breach.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I talked about how there is actually a contemporary organization called Repairers of the Breach. I don't know them that well. I don't know if you know them, Rick. But regardless, that idea is that in that same passage, Repairers of the Breach, it's that we seek the flourishing of the city we find ourselves in, the communities we find ourselves in, state, federal, world, right? We have this vision. In both Isaiah and Jeremiah, there is this concern with justice. And in chapter 29, Isaiah, look, I'm mixing them up because they're both so good. Jeremiah really does this very well. And in fact, what's so amazing about Jeremiah is that he's saying this in the context of exile. So even as God is bringing the people into exile in Babylon, he is still saying that even when you are there, seek the welfare of the people that surround you. And so 29 verse 7 says, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, how amazing is that? And what a great lesson that is for today. That we are seeking the welfare of all that is around us, because we can't withdraw and retreat from the world and from its troubles and its problems, that we actually have to seek justice and righteousness on its behalf. So that's just to round out that.
We are waxing poetic here. I mean, I'm thinking back to the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes episodes where we really struggle to get a positive
Excited
word in edgewise, and we are gushing.
Great.
We are gushing over Jeremiah. But here's my question: why do you think Isaiah gets all the accolades? I mean, when Handel puts it together, his Messiah, every other movement is from Isaiah, not from Jeremiah.
Yeah.
Some of the major songs that the ancient church will sing and the modern church will sing, the first song of Isaiah, the second song of Isaiah, the third song of Isaiah. Why is Jeremiah kind of the ugly stepchild here?
Yeah.
Why is Jeremiah not as known and used? Do you have any ideas?
Do you have an actual answer?
I don't. No, I'm
curious.
throwing that out into the ether.
I think Jeremiah is in the midst of the final death throes of Jerusalem, which makes what he's writing into that much more difficult. Isaiah was writing during Hezekiah's time, and that was, if you recall, in Chronicles, you could almost have called Hezekiah's time better than Josiah's.
Yeah.
So there's kind of that Isaiah's writing foreseeing this stuff. Hezekiah's time is pretty good, at least the first Isaiah chunk. Whereas Jeremiah is later. You don't really hear a whole lot about Josiah's time in Jeremiah. It's really Josiah's children, Jehoiakim, Jehoahaz, and Jehoiakim, and Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah. Yeah, those are the
Good job.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Thank goodness for the piece of paper that Elliot created, this document. So it's a more difficult time period, and he's speaking to the very specific political moves that are going on as well. The struggle between Babylon and Egypt, and how Judah and Jerusalem are making decisions politically, are we going to go with Babylon, or are we going to call Egypt's support in, and not relying on God and being faithful to God in the midst of that. So, and I feel like there's not as much hopeful language in Jeremiah as there is in Isaiah. Isaiah has a little bit more hopeful language in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I asked the question, and I just, like, my gut says that Isaiah is more of a poet.
Yeah.
And his command of language is so good. And Jeremiah he's the weeping prophet. He's like so much raw emotion.
Right.
And I think we find emotion uncomfortable.
Right.
We do.
I think that's true.
Unless it's positive emotion.
Yeah, I think there's a broader sweep of emotions in Isaiah. Isaiah is much more universal. I think, too, Isaiah presents historically such a wider time span, right? That in some sense, Tanya talked about this in our Isaiah episode. Isaiah actually, coming at the start of the prophets, gives you the entire sweep of the prophets in one book. It gives you in 1st Isaiah pre-fall, it gives you in 2nd Isaiah exile, and it gives you in 3rd Isaiah the return from exile. Right. And so in some sense, Isaiah, as the first major prophet in our canon, encapsulates all of the prophets in itself. I think you're right about human emotion as well. I think a big component, and you see this in a lot of the Christian appropriation of Isaiah and why Isaiah is just so famous, is the inclusion of foreigners that you find in 3rd Isaiah.
Yeah,
I think when 3rd Isaiah, and that's my point about universal scope, like there, you see seeds of that in Jeremiah, but this is really a development in Israel's faith that is forged in exile and the return from exile. We talked about this in our Isaiah episode. Foreigners become a really significant question in books like Ezra and Nehemiah. This is just something Jeremiah isn't dealing with in his time.
Right.
You know, I think in Jeremiah we get the beautiful picture of the new covenant, which we haven't talked about yet, and we will talk about that more, I suppose, in our next episode.
Yeah, probably.
But even the new covenant, which is very important in the New Testament, is huge. Yeah, I think it doesn't quite get the love Isaiah gets.
Yeah, it's not as universal.
It's not quite as universal.
Even chapter 31, where we get the new covenant, begins, I shall be a God for all Israel's kin groups, and they'll be a people for me. So we're still focused on the one nation, whereas Isaiah is more the nations coming to
big
my
time.
light.
The scope broadens so much in Isaiah. Even the new covenant you talked about at the start of the episode, the theme in Jeremiah, right, Rick, is this idea of a remnant. And that's really important, and that gets used in the New Testament and expanded. But when it's being discussed in Jeremiah, it's very much understood as Israel. It's like this new covenant is for Israel. The remnant is Israel. There isn't really quite yet this development of a perspective of all people being drawn in. I think as well. Last point is Isaiah. I think you were right about he's a poet. The beauty of his words, and that gets developed, I think, a ton in what scholars talk about as this eschatological vision at the end of Isaiah. I mean, this language.
The new heaven, the new earth.
The new heaven, the new earth. I mean, this dude's scope is universal. Jeremiah is not talking about a new heaven and a new earth.
Right.
Yeah,
and that's not a knock on Jeremiah. They're just different times and different messages. But, I mean, how easy is it to set that to like kind of sweeping music and scores?
Rather than Jeremiah at the bottom of a cistern.
Totally.
You can't.
It's a bit harder.
It's hard to get the tubas and the...
And then there's
involved.
There's also some in Jeremiah, and this is probably in the 20s chapters. There's a lot of submit to Babylon sort of stuff, and so there's a lot of language that I was, and we can talk some more about it perhaps in next week's episode. I'm really curious about all of this submitting to this other power sort of thing that Jeremiah is calling for at this point.
Right.
This is interesting.
Yeah.
Politically, in some ways, right? That you have to submit, and then because we need this to work out.
Because that's the Deuteronomistic historian's view, is that even though Babylon's an evil nation, God is using Babylon. Babylon is the hand of God in this movement. So that's why we're submitting. It's not just because they're a foreign nation. And even when Israel goes off and tries to like get an alliance with Egypt, they're like, oh no, you can't do that,
right?
Because that's going against this movement of God, which God is using Babylon for.
So I think some of that too goes
Right.
against
Sure.
why people down the line,
Right. Yep.
why they wouldn't want to relate back to Jeremiah as much,
Yeah.
because it's
Right.
because there's so much of that theme of submission to another
Yeah.
power.
It's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why? I'm curious what readers think about these two books. Which one do they like more? Which one do they identify with more? Maybe we'll get some email responses from folks.
Well, there's certainly more to talk about with Jeremiah, because we spent a lot of time in the early parts and kind of vaguely the later parts. So we'll.
I have a question about some of these early chapters, and this is connected to your question, Rick, of why maybe is there easier identification with Isaiah. How do you handle, the two of you, the theme in Jeremiah of judgment? I think one of the things that I find really difficult as I read the beginning of Jeremiah is there is just so much like, you have been wayward, you have done wrong, and now I am going to just utterly crush you, destroy you, judge you. Like, it's really quite harsh.
It almost
seems.
it revels in judgment.
Yeah.
There's an enjoying.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you
poetic.
wrestle with that? I mean, does that affect your image of God, your view of God?
This struck me specifically when we talked about that God is the potter section, and that's in chapter 18, so it's not, super early in here. But that whole thing where he has Jeremiah go and visit the potter, watch the potter make pottery, and how as the potter's trying to shape, he's shaping something, it's not quite the way he wants it, and he crushes it entirely and reforms it differently. It really, that particular illustration struck me in a way that, like, wow, just completely taking people and mushing them and remolding them felt, in some ways, more destructive of a way of reshaping what's going on than some of the other things where people are being slaughtered. I don't know why that struck me in particular.
When you say it struck you, do you mean you had trouble with this image or you liked the image? Because I actually can't tell.
No. I think I liked how it got to me in a way that was difficult. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Wow.
Like, it was a really effective.
Yeah.
I appreciated or respected the effectiveness of how I was like, oh, that's it, because it's uncomfortable. Like, you really think of like, sometimes my visualizations get a little too graphic.
Yeah.
So I'll let you all imagine what my visualization would be.
But that's really fascinating, Natalie, because this is, I think, what we're trying to talk about as the prophets, as these masters of visualization, of metaphor, that they're really trying to get these images that sink into people.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, I think we initially bristle at any judgment in the Bible.
Right.
Like, it's uncomfortable to us. Yep. And yet, we could probably, each of us, all of us listeners, think about situations in our life or in our world where we want justice, right? Where like something has happened, someone has been wronged, some people have been wronged, and we want the people who did that to pay for it.
Right.
And were they to be found guilty, were they to, we would be like, like justice was served. And so for people who are living in trauma, the idea of being treated unjustly or being oppressed is not a wild idea. They know exactly who did what to them and how it affected them and their family and their children. And so to want justice in that sense, like, I don't think they bristled at it.
Right.
I think they bristled. They bristled anytime they thought that they deserved the judgment.
Right.
But when they thought about the people who had hurt them and wronged them unjustly, I think they were like, yeah, bring it.
Right.
And so that's part of how I see this as a trauma document. And
Right.
I think like the more, I think you could probably track this through the scriptures, the more trauma is being dealt with, the more war, the more defeat, destruction, people being taken off into slavery, the more judgment language you hear,
Right.
because that's just where we go as human beings
Right.
when we hurt.
Right.
We just,
Yeah. No, that's helpful.
Yeah. The other thing that is kind of difficult to contend with is the way in which, again, the prophets speak to the political leaders, but it's not just those people who are suffering in these ways. It's the whole people,
Yep.
including those who've already been abused by their own leaders. They're also going to be impacted negatively by what comes of all of this.
Well, what's really interesting, and I think this is another thing that's difficult for us to read and think through as modern readers, is these ancient texts really have, I would maybe make the claim, they have very little reckoning with individual responsibility. Like they really often are working with collective communal notions, especially collective and communal notions of guilt. And so take Jeremiah 6:13, for example. For from the least to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for unjust gain, gain. And from prophet to priest, everyone deals falsely. And so there's very much a kind of like universalizing of guilt, of we've all disobeyed God, we've all not kept the covenant commands and requirements.
There is no one who is righteous, no, not one.
Exactly, which is a quotation from Isaiah, I believe.
Which then Paul picks up in Romans.
Paul.
But the only place that I think that hypothesis falls apart, the only place in Jeremiah, is when he talks about the shepherds.
Right.
And the kings,
Yes.
the leaders,
Right.
that there is judgment, that there's the people and then there's the leaders.
Right.
And there are times, absolutely, the people go astray. There are times that both go astray, the people and the leaders. But the leaders, the shepherds, get their own condemnation. And they're individuals with names and faces.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I think that's true. I think what's really fascinating, too, with this question that you talked about, Rick, of bristling at judgment, is I think one of the things that the prophets and the Old Testament as a whole kind of subverts is this human inclination to say that others deserve judgment.
Yeah.
So you were even talking about like, well, of course it's easy for them to see these people that have done this to us, they deserve judgment, which is true. And we find that in here. But I think actually one of the things I find so powerful about the prophets is it's really actually a look in the mirror of look at us, look at what we've done. And that's so countered, I think, to our natural human inclination. Even today, as I think about our own churches and communities, it's so often when things are going wrong, it's them.
Those people.
It's those people. And you can fill that in with any category.
Right.
But what does it mean to look in the mirror and say, when things are going wrong, how have we contributed?
Yeah.
Right. That's really what the prophets kind of force us to reckon with.
And that's what the Deuteronomistic historian, through the prophets, is trying to do, is to get Israel, the people of Israel, to realize their own fault, their own complicity in what has gone down.
Right.
Circumcise your hearts, folks.
And your ears. Don't forget your ears. I forget where I was going with that. But
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Just that they are looking at their own complicity in acts of injustice.
It was brilliant. Whatever I was
I
going to
know.
say, it was
Man, I
amazing.
interrupted you.
No, it wasn't you.
The plank from the eye.
I'm
Sorry,
getting old.
That's New Testament.
But no, the plank, I was thinking of that actually exact passage, Natalie, the plank in one's own eye, that Jesus is there is this tradition throughout our biblical canon of having to look at our own complicity. And I can see that Rick's brilliant idea just re-dawned on him.
Right. Well, it's the prophets are experts in giving judgment on all and holding up the mirrors, which is why almost all of the prophets are persecuted for what they do. And we'll get to it, but Jeremiah ends up literally thrown down a cistern.
Yes.
I mean, he is abused in terrible ways.
Yes.
Because he keeps saying,
Right.
Because he
y'all
keeps trying
did
to bring
this.
the prophetic word, and the people don't want to hear that.
Right. Right.
They're not into that.
He went from preaching to meddling. Is how they.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, I think this is maybe neither here nor there, but I had a professor of New Testament once. I think it can be kind of in vogue as Christians to be like, we need to be prophetic. We need to be prophetic. And that's true. Don't get me wrong. That is completely true. But I remember he would always joke like, you don't want to be a prophet.
No.
This isn't a descriptor you put in your Instagram bio, right? Like it is a very hard life to be a prophet. You are called. One does not choose to become a prophet, and we didn't even talk much about Jeremiah's call. The Lord literally places His word inside of Jeremiah's mouth.
He calls him before he is born.
Right. I mean,
in your mother's womb.
Right, and we'll see in later chapters he suffers significant persecution. He has no friends. He's thrown from one place to the next, which is just.
Tanya said that last week. Well, in one of the Isaiah episodes where we had Tanya on, she too also said, "I do not think the life of a prophet is a good, easy life. That is the hard life."
Maybe though the example we can draw from the prophets is that truth and justice doesn't always please. Truth and justice are hard, and that's true in a myriad of contexts. So I think one thing I often think to myself is, if I'm pleasing everyone around me, I'm probably doing something wrong, right?
Yeah.
Because again, this is the image of the false prophets. They're people pleasers. Now, you have to be wary that you don't take that too extreme, right? Yeah. Oh, I'm a prophet because I upset everyone around me.
I think a lot of what sort of passes like in Christian circles, and I would say this like more liberal churches and more conservative churches, that when people call themselves a prophetic preacher, it's because they're standing in front of people who already agree with them, and they're saying things that they all agree with.
Right.
And then they're saying, I'm a prophet because I've said this thing, and everyone's like, amen. And they're not saying it to the people that
are in front of them.
Right.
Yeah. I think the challenge, this is like preacher talk now, but the challenge is the community you're in. What is the word that they need to hear?
Right.
And I think you're completely right. You do find in a lot of churches preaching that just speaks to the people in their midst, what they already think. And it just gets a riling round of applause, right?
Right. Whereas true prophetic preaching would be to go in front of the people who you love and that are like you and saying, here's where we have missed the mark.
Right.
Like that's prophetic preaching.
Right. Yes.
And everyone goes away going, oh.
Yeah.
Like that's when you've given a prophetic sermon.
Right.
Not when everyone's going like, good sermon, Reverend, at the back door.
No one's greeting Jeremiah at the back door to shake his hand.
No, that was really powerful. I'm going to watch that again on YouTube.
Right.
Like, no.
Right. Which doesn't mean there's not something to be said for those kinds of sermons. Like certainly there's a time and a place for those sermons too.
Yeah.
But I think we're both naming something we've seen in our lives, which is a certain style of preaching that's like, this is it. This is Sunday in, Sunday out, right? Like that's what it is.
Well, and I assume from a priest's perspective, any congregation you're preaching to is diverse enough that some days you have to preach comfort because the people there need comfort.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Or some cohort of the people there need comfort and they need to hear that. Yeah. And sometimes you need to preach challenge because the people sitting in the room or some section of the people in the room need that challenge in a particular way.
Right.
So there's a balance there between the things going on because our lives are not singular in what we're experiencing at any time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that was quite a bit of Jeremiah for the day. May we all confess our sins for the things done, left undone, done on our behalves. The evils done on our behalf. That was the language from one of our confessions that I was trying to come to that related here.
Yeah.
We're going to see a little bit more about the hope to be found in Jeremiah and what Jeremiah has to say about the nations and some of the later chapters of Jeremiah next week. In the meantime, enjoy reading about the fall of Jerusalem. And we'll catch you next week.
See you then.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley.
Elliot Van Hoy.
And Natalie Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalie Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org. Oh, balm in Gilead.
There is a balm
In Gilead.
Is there no balm in Gilead?
To
heal the sin sick soul.
Cue Michael Curry.